Wheel of Genre, the show for readers who are freaks and geeks. Bob tells me that's a circus reference. I wash my hands at this one. Each week we spin the wheel and land on a new genre. Spies, mysteries, horror, romance, SF. It's all on the shelf. And right now we are reading every short story in Harlan Ellison's Dangerous Visions anthology, including this one, J.G. Ballard's or Ballard's The Recognitions. I'm Zach, and this week I'm really interested in how I thought I knew what this was about, or like what the message of this story was, and then the internet tells me, no, I'm a bad reader.
So the internet tells me every day. I'm Bob. I'm really interested in, I guess, how much of a dream this is. And I'd be curious to know, is this J.G. Ballard's dream? That's what it feels like. And then I want to know why Harlan Ellison thinks that J.G. Ballard is kind of the leader of English sci-fi. He's the captain. He's the guy in the forefront.
All right, Bob, what happens in this story? So there's this mystery of the cages, right? And what is so interesting to me is how he recognizes that it's a smell he knows, but that he doesn't quite know. So he doesn't see the figures like you said, but then later, after this whole sailor bit, the sailors crawling in and out of the cages, the very last part of it, he finally sees the inhabitants of these cages. And I'll just read it. It says, "A voice shouted behind me a single obscene word. I turned to find its source and saw one of the occupants watching me with cold eyes. As I started, he raised his hand and moved the fingers in a perverted gesture." So first he sees one, and then he sees another, and the story ends with the narrator claiming, "At last, I recognize the smell that came from the cages." It's just so frustrating. And, I talked about this when we opened the episode. I just assumed that the inhabitants of the cages were the sailors. But when I got online and read what people were saying about this, it's actually this great mystery. We never know what he recognized in those cages. So I'm curious, as you were reading it, what did you think they were?
It's a great title, The Recognition That We Can't Recognize. Yeah, I completely assume that they're people. They are gesturing rudely. They're catcalling him. They're yelling after him, and the sailors just went into the cages. So my idea is this weird outsider circus, not like the family-friendly one that you were going to, Zach, but something dark going on where they're kidnapping people, luring them into cages, and then they travel on. These two who are tending to the people there, or who are tending to the inhabitants of the cages, putting up these posters. All of the posters are stolen, by the way, from the other circus, and they're just using them. They tell this guy who wandered in, because he asks, when is the circus going to open? They say, it's open right now. It's open right now. Well, when is it going to close? First thing tomorrow morning. So these people they're doing whatever they're doing seems illegal or seems magical to the point where someone's going to track them down because what they're doing is going far beyond the boundary of family-friendly circus. These are strange carnies here. But it is a mystery because when the sailors get in one of the cages, which they were sure they had seen something inside, when they look at it more closely, they say it's bloody empty. They get really upset, and that's why they want to go in. But they get trapped in there later, so they replace whatever was there before. However, they seem to have lost some kind of humanity because he doesn't say, "I recognize those sailors." He just says, "Oh, I finally understand that smell is, sweaty human," or whatever he's smelling, and that those fingers, there's not a lot of animals with recognizable fingers that can do gestures, that can also make cat calls and speak in a language we understand. So it's got to be human. But there's some other magic happening where they forget themselves. They're not trying to get out of the cages. They're not asking for help. When they go in, they forget something about themselves, and they just become rude cage people.
I think magic is really the right word for this transformation, because to me, this story doesn't feel like science fiction. It feels like somewhere in between fantasy and fairy tale. Especially because you seem to have to walk through this transformative space to find this carnival, this circus that is hidden away from the main real world and seems to operate according to its own rules and logic. What really interested me about it is the fact that he says it's Midsummer Eve.
Mm.
and he's walking through the woods. And it reminds me so much, just like the way it's written, of Midsummer's Night Dream by
Hmm.
Shakespeare, in the sense that you have this movement from kind of what Marjorie Garber calls the Shakespeare triple pattern, the movement from society out to the wilderness and then back again. Because, he's in society, but then as he goes through the woods, there's some very psychedelic language that's used to
Mm.
describe what he sees as he goes through the woods, like roots snaking and slithering, things like that. It's not too psychedelic, but it's still kind of a weird thing. But then as he gets to the carnival, really the only inhabitants he sees are this alluring woman, and what Ballard calls a dwarf, a little person. It's very much of the school of like little people have some kind of like, it creates an atmosphere. We'll put it like that. He's engaging in the timeless tradition of using little people as like signifiers of a magical environment. See Roald Dahl's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory for a good example of this. But I do wonder, have you read Ballard before? Like,
No.
in your experience of reading him, is it like this? No.
No, I never read him before. This is the first time. But you're right. Ellison, in the foreword, I think he says, "And what is this story? Folk tale, fantasy, legend?" Yeah, it's unclear because it's kind of genreless.
I did like what Ellison wrote, where he describes J.G. Ballard's style as like a 4-color lithography. But then upon closer inspection, it resembles pointillism. And then when you look even closer than that, you realize it's more like just a series of disconnected dots. I've read a lot of descriptions of authors from Harlan Ellison at this point. And actually, this was the first one that I thought was actually not just useful, but kind of beautiful. Like, it changed the way that I read J.G. Ballard. Mostly just because Ballard loves the tangent. And I think that this seems to be like the hallmark of his style, at least at this point in his writing career. I've only read 1 or 2 Ballard books, but they're like late career books. So I don't know how to compare them quite to this. And it's been several years, but like in this one, he's talking about the smell. He's talking about the cages. We're in this setting. We're following the main path of the narrative. But then he'll say, "Beside me, the horses gave off a pleasant scent of bran and sweat. Their downcast heads, lowered to the grass by the water's edge, seemed to hide from me some secret concealed within their luminous eyes." And it's just interesting how, like, the thrust of the story is find the smell. What's this smell? We're going to ruminate on this smell until finally the recognition, but then he'll just be like, "Oh, and by the way, here's some details about the horses and their luminous eyes." And that's that series of disconnected dots that I think Ellison was pointing towards in his introduction.
The disconnected dots. When you're reading that, I really identify with that. Going to work really early, trying to hide out. I probably smell like bran, eating oatmeal and sweat, trying to do work so no one notices me. And inevitably someone does. What do you think of Ballard's idea about what this story means? I really love the forwards and afterwards. I know some people might not, but I think they're extremely interesting. And he says that the story is in fact not a piece of hard-won misanthropy. So it's not misanthropy, but a comment on some of the more unusual perspectives that separate us. The most important characters whose motives are key to the story are the young woman and her dwarf. Why do they take this dismal circus on its endless tour? And I think that is kind of interesting to look at here. Why are they doing this? This is so strange. And again, it feels almost like a dream where he's asking, why did I experience this story? Why would people take these people out? So I don't, the person who's walking through this and having this strange experience, he doesn't really do anything. Why wouldn't you go and try to get these people out of their cages? If they're humans, you got to go do something about it. That's terrible. But for him, there's something really important about the recognition. Now he's run into smelly, stinky, trying to hide away humans in cages. And he says that the cage is the key here, because he also says sometimes it is difficult to tell on which side of the bars we are. The real gaps between the bars are the sutures of one's own skull. So it's a weird exploration of, I guess, our willingness to be trapped in things. is what he's trying to do, and doing that through the circus. But what do you think about, I mean, the weirdness of this narrator who's just telling us this weird dreamlike experience and does not get involved, just has to recognize, just has to see the truth of this. What do you think is the point of that? What's going on for this to you as a reader?
I don't know. I mean, I think you're really right to diagnose the narrator / protagonist as essentially doing nothing. All he does is come to like a moment of gnosis. You know, he finally sees the light. He comes to some realization, but I think that there might be a disconnect here. And I'll speak for myself, but I suspect that it's a disconnect between every reader and J.G. Ballard, where based off of what Ballard says at the end of it, the final word he says, I think that he believes that everyone understands his message clearly. So he thinks that everyone understands what he's going for. And from that point, he can then ask, okay, what are the motives of the young woman and her dwarf? You know, but I think that as a reader, I think we're still stuck on fundamental questions of how to interpret this, of what does it mean? We can't even begin to speculate on the woman and her dwarf because, frankly, we don't even know what they're doing in the first place, much less why they're doing it. We're not in a position to judge that. I think maybe the issue is that Ballard believes that since his character went through this transformation, his character came to this moment of recognition, that the readers were also there with the character, recognizing with him. But unfortunately, that's just not the case. So it's really hard to speculate.
I would be really interested to hear if that's what he thinks. I have a feeling that maybe it could be, everyone's with me. We're all on the same page. But I have another feeling that it is an invitation to kind of do almost like active imagination, because it is, again, I'm going to say it again, it's very dreamlike. And at the end, when we have that recognition, we can choose what the recognition is, but we think the man has. And I think what we might do is go and ask those two people who are doing this, in our own imagination, why are you doing this? And then pursue this story further and try and figure it out. And I don't think he would really even care what our conclusion came to. I think the premise of people in cages and someone not doing anything about it, but recognizing, I know that smell is me. That smells just like me, but what is that inside of that cage? Having that experience, I think, is what he wants you to do. I don't think it's necessarily, it's people in cages. That was the goal. Soylent Green is people. Let's move on. I think he wants you to inhabit this dream world.
I really love what you're saying about active imagination here. And I think for a lot of stories, I would kind of bristle at active imagination, but those are stories that are more like realistically grounded, or the author kind of gives you more. But here, I think Ballard's style actively invites you to kind of actively imagine and speculate and generate the meaning for yourself based off of what loose threads you have, simply because throughout the story, he drops these rhetorical questions at you. And it's not just at the end with why do they take this dismal circus on its endless tour? No, throughout the actual body of the story itself, the narrator himself is asking these rhetorical questions, which the author doesn't even bother to try to give an answer to. But it feels like it should be a prompt for us, the readers, to really dive into it. Just as an example, quote, involuntarily I found myself staring at the young woman. Was this, then, the point of this strange and pathetic menagerie? That there were no animals at all, at least in most of the cages, and that what was being exhibited was simply nothing, merely the cages themselves, the essence of imprisonment with all of its ambiguities? Was this a zoo in the abstract, some kind of bizarre comment on the meaning of life? And then my expectation is for him to be like, yes or no. But instead he just goes off to do something else. And it's just kind of like, oh, okay. All right.
It's a great setup. It reminds me of Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, a very, I think, underrated Murakami book. I think that's my favorite of his books. Character ends up in this weird world where he's doing, what's that called? He's an oracle. He's a bone guy. Trying to like get the dreams out of skulls, kind of like what people used to do, like trying to, how in ancient China people would write on bones, and turtle shells. So this guy has to read similar things that have been written by other people's dreams, and he has to kind of interpret them through the skulls. But the whole time it's like, what on earth am I doing here? What on earth is the point of this? Okay, I'm getting these dreams, but why? And I think it puts you into kind of a dream headspace, and you have to think a little bit about why you've been put there, I guess, and why they've brought this circus around. In that book, of course, Murakami teases it out. And this is just a short story. I think Ballard just wants us to get thinking about stories in that way. Do you think, though, is he really, the way that Harlan says is he's the leader of the British school of science fiction, but he also says he doesn't have platitudes. He doesn't use cliches. He doesn't feel like the leader of a school of science fiction because every time he writes, it's totally different. But in this style, could you imagine this being, doesn't feel like science fiction at all, but can you imagine this kind of style of getting people to question the relationship between things and not just telling people these things? Does that feel like, I guess, sci-fi being written at this time? Can we compare it to anything in Dangerous Visions or anything around the time that it came out?
I think the closest comparison would probably be Fritz Leiber's Gonna Roll the Bones, which we saw, 20 stories back. But that's kind of, well, I was going to say stylistically, but yeah, stylistically, as well as the kind of invitation, this kind of dream space, which ends on an ambiguous note and as a kind of invitation to the reader to pull the meaning out of the thin air and to kind of create it for themselves. I wish I could call this fantasy, but it's not. It's not fantasy in the way that I think we generally understand fantasy, but it's just hard because I feel like if I wanted to ask someone, where would I go to read a novel version of these kind of tall tales or fairy tales or something like that? I honestly don't know where I would turn.
Your dreams.
Yeah.
I still think
Dream Journal.
Dream Journal. I bet it's going to be similar to what we will read in the Vandermeer collection, Weird Tales. It's unclassifiable. It gives you a weird experience. Weird things are going on.
Yeah. Spoiler alert, we're reading Vandermeer's The Weird Anthology next. Uh-oh.
I'm excited.
All right. Well, I don't have too much more to say about this one. I think that I want to prioritize reading more J.G. Ballard. However, I say that based off of the absolutely wonderful time I've had reading his other novels and not necessarily this story.
Okay. That sounds great. On to J.G. Ballard.
Cool. All right. Talk to you later, Bob.
Talk to you later, Zach.